The 1960s. There were a few things then to take your mind off the last years of steam on the railways. There was Motown or Dylan, miniskirts and the Cold War. But it was a bittersweet time, one in which school kept getting in the way. Music soothed the pain, but as a teenager I couldn't see why my time had to be wasted by education. Steam was running out. The best thing about my school was the playing fields. A grandstand view of the line coming from Buxton to Manchester. All kinds of traffic would pass. Freights, parcels, local passenger and express services. I witnessed many interesting workings from the windows of my classroom when I should have been paying attention. One of the finer sightings, for instance, was a rebuilt Patriot 45530, Sir Frank Ree. At that time, 63 I think, it belonged to Longsight. I wished it had belonged to me. We, the school's loco spotters, would gather at break times to watch what went past and swap exaggerated stories about sheds we'd bunked, girls and music. It was unfair though. The best locos always seemed to go past during lesson times. Of course, it was forbidden to gather near the fence, so we had to crouch behind a slight rise in the ground. If something really good went past, we would break cover and cheer, waving at the driver. Sometimes they whistled at our display of pleasure. The units from the Glossop line just got derisory groans, although often they would honk their horn. Mind you, our classrooms didn't have the kind of view that was on offer to the school at Newton Heath. My old boy back then was a policeman, a traffic cop. Later in the 70s, a colleague of his commissioned a painting from my mum of a Super D. It turned out that, in another life, he'd been a fireman from Edgeley. He'd fired a Super D several times and remembered boys at the end of the playing fields as they cheered the loco on. The driver had said that we were bonkers, but he needed all the encouragement he could get. As my dad's friend said, the Ds were hard-hearted machines. They had their own slow way of doing things, and they wouldn't be rushed. Driving them, if you made a mistake, they would pay you back. But they would pull all right. I like to think of us giving that driver something to smile about. The Ds did seem a bit basic, although they did have a certain elegance about them, refined from the G2s as they were. Another time, we gave a Jubilee a good cheer. I can't remember what the number was, but our jubilation attracted the attention of the authorities. The deputy head himself came along and berated us for our childish activities. We all got detention. The guy gave me a row for my railway badges. Do you remember those enamel loco badges? Ironically, my maths master also wore them. I didn't mention that. It wouldn't be fair. Anyway, he told me to get rid of the ironmongery. I was sometimes punished for staring at the railway. My first maths mistress, we'll call her Mrs. S, was an enthusiast of corporal punishment. I'll admit, I wasn't very bright, especially at maths, but after a while she began to single me out. When she saw me steal a brief glance out of the window at a passing train, she fired maths conundrums at me. If my answers to her riddles failed to satisfy, they never did, by the way, I would receive a stinging hard slap on the side of my face. As time went on, Mrs. S became more enthusiastic. Although small, she was deceptively strong. The slaps became more like heavy blows, until one ill-starred day she actually knocked me out, to the delight of many of my classmates. I came round after what must have been only a few moments. My parents seemed to hold the view that this was what I deserved, as they suspected that I'd been taking quite a bit of time off school to experience the last days of steam. Mrs. S left suddenly after my first year at the grammar school, on health grounds, at least that's what the word in the school was. Before she'd been forced to leave, I had made a coach for my 00 gauge model railway, fitted with a tiny lavatory compartment, where I stuck a 4mm scale figure of Mrs. S. She was unable to escape, and is still there today. Our next maths teacher was a reasonable, kind soul who nevertheless managed to keep order in the class. I don't know how he did that, but we respected him. All the more so when I discovered that he was a railway enthusiast. He appeared at the school model railway club one afternoon, and I had some good discussions with him about railways. My maths didn't improve, but Mr. R didn't seem to feel the need to punish me, nor did he mind me looking out at the trains, probably because he was looking too. A few years later, near to that fateful August when steam ended, I heard a dreadfully painful bubbling Stanier hooter nearby, and winced to think of the rusty fretful hulk that had emitted that distressed wail. I looked up at Mr. R, and he acknowledged my glance with a sad frown, as if agreeing with me. Cricket was one of the things I least liked. Mr. R, unfortunately, had quite a thing about it, and would take the class out onto the field for an hour or so. Some of the lads loved it, which is fair enough. On one occasion I was a fielder, and stationed very near to the fence for the railway lines, every dark cloud and all that. While at my post, bored beyond imagining, I heard a thunderous roar coming closer, and I turned round to witness the awe-inspiring sight of what I thought might be a Royal Scot coming at speed from the Buxton line. It was on the head of a long freight train. It was filthy and uncared for, but what a sight to a young lad. Now, at this point, I was aware of a great deal of shouting and my name being called. I assumed that this was because of the loco, so I was really surprised when the next thing I felt was a massive blow on my back which felled me and knocked all the breath out of my puny body. Someone had knocked a real haymaker, and runs were being furiously taken, literally behind my back. Mr. R came up, and I thought he was going to give me a row for not paying attention, but he just said, "Did you get the number of that loco, Robinson? Was it a Scot?" I said I thought it might have been 45536. Mr. R smiled and said, "Ah, a patriot." That evening I went home and looked it up in my Ian Allen ABC. Robbo was right. The Patriots were an interesting class, nominally rebuilt from the LNWR Clawtons, themselves fascinating locos. The details are complicated, but to hugely simplify, some of them had the large Clawton wheel bosses. They were also known as baby Scots. My engine-driving uncle had mentioned these a few times, and noted that they were easy to drive, well, for my uncle maybe, and reasonably powerful when in good condition. So after that, of course, I had a soft spot for them, not that I saw many. As time went on in the 60s, we only really saw Stanier locos and 8Fs mostly. They were great machines, with a feeling of bulk and power about them. When we occasionally saw a Black 5 or a Jubilee, that was cause for celebration. Actually, towards the end, 9Fs seemed to become more common round our neck of the woods. Oh, I would have loved to have been around a bit earlier and seen a Robinson Director or a parallel boiler Scot. But I know that I was lucky to see what I did. I had a special affection for the old LNWR locos, but only saw those in books, like Tuplin's LNWR work, another borrow from Stalybridge Library. I did try to make a model of one. A well-meaning and generous aunt had given me a gem white metal kit, you remember those, one Christmas, but it was beyond me in the days before epoxy or cyanoadhesives. I had actually tried to solder it with my dad's soldering iron. Can you imagine the sad melted mess? I was so upset. I didn't know then about low melting point solder. Well, Kitmaster saved the day with their release of a 9F kit and the standard Mogul. Those had pride of place on my bedroom cabinet until I went away to college. My gran had a farm in Coppenall. Apart from her being a lovely person, the added attraction was that my engine driver uncle lived there. and I had a grandstand view of the 4 tracks coming north out of Crewe. Many hours were spent beside the line as a lad, with a good number of super loco sightings in the very early 60s, but dark clouds were on the horizon, as the electrics were coming to sweep everything away in a sea of uniformity. The Duchesses would be branded with those cabside stripes and relegated to freight turns. What a way to treat such wonderful machines. When my uncle, Walter, was driving a train back to Crewe, he had a special whistle code he used, a crow and 3 pops, to let Gran know that he'd be home soon. At that point she scurried about, getting his dinner ready. Like many footplatemen, he never learned to drive a car, only trading his trusty old bike for a moped later. Also like many locomen, he had a prodigious capacity for booze. I think that it was due to the heat and exertion of the footplate. He often repeated that he'd had to shift 9 tons of coal on a Perth trip. You can't do that without breaking sweat. My memories were that there was always a fugitive smell of steam oil, coal, brill cream and beer about him. He also had respiratory problems, due no doubt to his early days at Crewe Shed. He'd started in the war years as a cleaner, and often enough for someone who professed no interest in the job when I knew him, my mum told me he'd always wanted to be an engine driver. Walter was very outspoken, and it didn't take long before he found himself the wrong side of the gang foreman. The reward was a couple of months box diving, cleaning out the firebox of a loco while it was still unpleasantly warm. I can only imagine what a health hazard that must have been. Obviously, his fellow cleaners weren't very keen on him either, as on one occasion they locked him in the firebox for a few hours. There was a bit of trouble after that. But as they say, you can't keep a good man down, and before long he'd squeezed out of the fire hole and was a past cleaner, able to work as a fireman. Among many tales of this time, he told of one night when his driver had to shunt their ammunition train into a tunnel during an air raid. They struggled to breathe in the tunnel but didn't dare come out. Walter said he kept thinking, what if a bomb had fallen and made the tunnel cave in? But luckily they emerged safely. On another occasion, they were strafed by a German fighter and had some wagons damaged and on fire. Thankfully not ammunition that time. He told me about firing a local train into Crewe during a bombing raid. His driver, quite understandably, had become overwhelmed and was on the floor cowering and whimpering with fear. Walter took over, but the driver then started to wrestle with him, irrationally not wanting him to touch the regulator or the gear. The result was that they hit the buffers rather hard and they damaged the front of the loco. Luckily for my uncle, when the driver eventually came to his senses, he took full responsibility, although the man was relegated to the shed pilot job for the rest of his life. I have hazy memories of my mum taking me to Gresty Lane, where my uncle would be in charge of a ginty, punching wagons around the yard. She'd often take him his lunch, and that was where I had my first footplate ride, when I was 4. I guess I was doomed to be a railway enthusiast after that. Back then we lived in Crewe until I was 10. I had a habit of bunking school almost every day to go to Gresty Lane. At the end of his tether, my dad asked me just what would keep me in school. Well, every man has his price, and mine was a Hornby 00 Duchess Pacific, which I still treasure. There were some surprising benefits to having a railwayman in the family. You'll have heard the expression, falling off the back of a wagon. Well, at Gresty Lane, there were often over-enthusiastic shunts where a wagon would be derailed or reduced to matchwood. If it contained chocolate, cereals or bananas for instance, then we, and the other railmen's families, were often the beneficiaries. I vividly remember my uncle turning up with a couple of crates of bananas. His mate had a van which was often used to distribute the bounty of a rough shunt. When my dad opened the crate, out ran a huge black spider. It was enormous. I jumped up onto a chair while my mum tried to fend it off with the yard brush. Eventually my dad dispatched the poor creature with a shovel, and I can still recall the sickening noise it made when the shovel found its target. On another occasion, we inherited a big crate of chocolate from the yard. Too much of it. We were all sick of chocolates after that. These days I have a thing about Class 37s, themselves now becoming heritage traction. We live near the Cambrian coastline, and I can't disguise my excitement when a 37 growls past in the night like something from Jurassic Park. The spine tingles, and I feel a sense of pleasure and pride that I'm a lifelong greiser. But I know that my uncle, if he were still alive, would do that half smile of his and say, "Oh, not another bloody froth box." Thanks for listening this far. If you like this story, please subscribe and tune in for the next story about steam.